talk about globalization in the next series of videos, and I'm very happy to tell you that this is the last series of videos of the year. So, you guys, whether you're in my class or not, I wish you the best as we approach this AP exam and your endeavors beyond. Alright, so let's talk a little bit, let's talk a little bit about what globalization is first. It's largely an economic idea, although we could certainly talk about some of the political, social, and cultural influences that globalization has. To be very broad, you could say that globalization is the greater sense of interconnectedness throughout the world. Um, in a lot of ways, of course, this is not exclusively a 21st century phenomenon. We could trace ourselves back to the voyages of Zheng He, or even the Silk Road from the Roman Empire and Han China to say, of course, there have been times in the past where there has been a global trade network. But of course, globalization is also unique in our time period because of our virtually instantaneous access to information, which certainly makes it easier to trade and communicate from one side of the world to the other. So again, we could say that, the extension of the Indian Ocean trade network or imperialism among the Europeans was technically globalization, but it's not on the same large scale as 20th century or 21st century globalization. So the globalization that we want to talk about really expands after the Cold War. And Eastern Bloc nations that had previously been under the control of the Soviet Union were unable to freely control with capitalist democracies during the Cold War. We also start to see, so what we see happen then is that these newly independent nations are going to have much more freedom to shape their economy and their foreign trade. Also, we see that once the Cold War is over, the non-alignment movement is no longer necessary. So the countries that were committed to the non-alignment movement, countries like India or Egypt, are now going to slowly start to relax their trade restrictions in the 1990s or so. So globalization also increases once those tensions that the Cold War brought on start to ease. Globalization is not without its critics. This is just the beginning of talking about that. Once we get a better sense of how globalization works, I actually want to return to talking about some of the opposition to globalization, but just as a very, very brief overview. There is a lot of complaints about labor exploitation. Of course, in certain instances, we take advantage of cheap labor from foreign nations for our production, like the idea that products that are manufactured by a company like Apple, right? That technically they are designed in the U.S., but they're all manufactured in places like China because the cost of labor is so much cheaper, right? And also there is an argument that there is a lot of environmental. There are a lot of environmental consequences to globalization. The idea that, in certain countries, certain parts of the world, there are less environmental regulations, right? So if you transfer your production to another place that doesn't have those same kind of regulations, this is ultimately more devastating to the environment. And of course, with just the general idea, with globalization, the world is a lot smaller than we make it out to be. And if we do not pay attention to the environment, it will eventually impact us anyway. The idea that in certain instances, the smog from places as far away as China can gradually waft over to a place like Los Angeles and impact its environment. So it's kind of strange for us to ignore environmental regulations on one part of the earth and impose them on another. Ultimately, we all live on the same planet. We're all going to feel the impact of these problems over time. Alright, so the best way I think to talk about globalization is to actually look at how it pans out in different parts of the world. So let's zero in on Asia first. As you are aware, of course, Asia was a place that had a lot of influence among Western powers during the Cold War. Japan, of course, had a pretty unique experience because Japan was not ever a communist country, right? Japan very, very quickly after the end of the Second World War gets a lot of economic assistance actually directly from the U.S. So from the very country that dropped the bomb on it, because they become a capitalist economy, the U.S. and Japan essentially become economic allies. Right, so the U.S. invests millions of dollars in the Japanese economy after World War II, rather. And one of the other things that's unique about Japan is that since it's an island and since it's such a small nation, it lacks adequate natural resources. So it has to bring in materials to manufacture its goods. So Japan can never be fully economically independent just because it is so small, right? Actually, going back, one of the major reasons why it was an imperialistic nation, right? Because it wanted to expand its abilities to have a more self-sufficient economy, right? But after World War II, and Japan clearly has to relinquish all the territorial gains that it had, this is going to return as a problem. In the 1980s, Japan experienced an economic boom, particularly with regard to the automotive industry. You can see, actually, this only dates back to the 1990s, but you see that in the 1980s there was less of an economic growth actually than there was in previous decades. But the vast majority of first of all exports going outside of Japan or going to the United States specifically. One of the strongest industries in Japan, again, is the automotive industry. And we can think about how many different Japanese automobiles are manufactured and sold in the US, right? We could consider companies like Honda, Toyota, Nissan, and so on, right? Japan has had a relatively fluctuating economy throughout the late 20th and early 21st century. There was an economic downturn that started in the 1990s, which has not fully recovered. So, for example, we can see that the GDP of Japan was actually the same in 1996 as it was in 2008. So, Japan certainly is not marked by economic growth. Another problem that Japan has experienced is that it has a fairly significant, not fairly, it has a very significant elderly population that obviously is too old to work, but that the younger working generations have to support. Okay, let's move on to certain countries that have experienced a lot of economic growth since the Cold War. And these countries are nicknamed the Asian Tigers. They're smaller Asian influences, right? Not nearly as big as a country like China, but nonetheless still incredibly significant in terms of their economic growth, right? So the four Asian Tigers are Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and South Korea. And their governments, their governments are pretty strong and stable, and they have instituted a number of economic policies, really starting in the 1960s, that promoted more of an export-oriented economy. Also, these countries rapidly industrialized, and they became major exporters and international centers of banking, finance, and information technology. So it's actually the IT sector in particular that has grown in these countries that is obviously very lucrative in this IT-centered world. And we can, again, if we really want to think about how globalization impacts us, we could, again, consider certain products in the IT or computer-related industry that come from these parts of the world. In particular, I think of the emphasis or the influence that a country like Korea has over us. Again, if we think about in certain circumstances, automotive industry like the Hyundai car company is from Korea, but I also think about the prominence of the Samsung industry, right, which is also Korean. So this gives us indicators as to how those industries have grown. So these are very successful examples of globalization. And then the last, actually no, two more Asian examples I want to use. I want to talk about China. China has a fairly complex economy in the sense that, of course, the state is still, technically speaking, a communist state. But nonetheless, in the 1980s and 1990s, there were some significant reforms to China's economy, and it started to become more of a competitor on the world stage. So, despite the fact that the Chinese government still remains a communist state, in terms of the way that the actual economy functions, it's now a little bit more quasi capitalist, one could say, right? In 1989, the Shanghai Stock Index opened up, and also the Chinese government allowed for private ownership of industries. And over time, foreign firms invested to build factories in China to take advantage of low wage costs. So now, oftentimes, you see China actually is a source or is a location for outsourced labor from countries like the United States, right? So again, globalization, every time we think about, I mean, in particular, an article of clothing that is made in China, we can consider how that is an example of globalization, right? Now, China's economy is the third largest in the world, behind the U.S. and the EU. There is still a significant discrepancy uh, there's still a significant gap between the wealthy and the poor in China, and there's still, in terms of ownership of property, there still is virtually none of that, because at least in that instance, the communist influence remains strong. So China has certainly grown as a result of globalization. It is certainly more involved in global trade, right? But in terms of the way it's impacted China's actual living standards, it very much varies based on where you fall in the social hierarchy. India, in some ways, we see a lot of similarities, I think, with China, partially because this is also an incredibly large country. India has the second highest population in the entire world, behind China. In the early 1990s, again, remember that India was part of the non-alignment movement during the Cold War. But then after the Cold War ends, India starts to open up its markets and allow for foreign imports into the economy. And India also is very much a good example of globalization, because it had, especially in the 1990s and thereafter, a very highly educated English-speaking workforce, and so it was a logical place for labor to be outsourced. And labor in the IT industry, even the IT communications industry, could be fairly easily outsourced because so many members of the workforce could speak English. India developed a very significant software and information technology industry, and it's really seen now as a powerhouse for those industries. Also, American and European companies increasingly invested in India because they look to outsource jobs and take advantage of lower labor costs. And multinational corporations such as Microsoft and Google invested in the Indian economy. You see that with the influx of corporate wealth and foreign goods, there is a thriving commercial culture among India's middle class. After the year 2000 or so, the Indian middle class grew pretty substantially. In 2014, the Indian middle class was estimated to be the largest in the world, with more than 350 million people. But nonetheless, the majority of Indians, at least in urban areas, still remain in poverty. The economic sector, or the economic growth rather, in India has been limited to the private sector. So, people who don't have the skills that are needed at the global level are not benefiting from the growth of India's economy. And the Indian government, despite the fact that it is democratic, has done little to address the problems of its poorest citizens. So the poorest of the poor in India still do not have access to clean water, healthcare, education, or other social services. And the government also has claimed to build roads or other infrastructure projects in India's rural areas, but many of these contracts only exist on paper, and we have very little proof that they're actually happening. So in terms of the case studies in Asia, I'm hoping that some of the takeaways you'll see is that, of course, no country experiences globalization in exactly the same way, that certain countries benefit from globalization, but only in certain parts of the socioeconomic hierarchy, that there still is, largely because, of course, globalization involves an embrace of capitalism. It does not mean that everyone in a country benefits from globalization. Often the working class is still very much suffering as a result of that. We still have a little bit more to go with globalization, but at the interest of keeping these videos at a reasonable length, let's take a break, and then we're going to pick up with a few more case studies, and then we'll talk about some of the responses to globalization throughout the world. Okay, so stay tuned for that, and thanks.